on with the, our control group. And I should say our design was a bit convoluted, to be quite honest. We found it hard going because we were surveying all the time. Basically, we did 4 tranches of surveys. Now that's a lot to ask. That's a lot to ask your respondents to sort of be filling in online surveys every few months, and even harder to ask a control group who basically getting nothing for it. So partway through, because our control group numbers were dropping, we started to pay everybody a £30 voucher to encourage them to fill their surveys in. It was something we had to bring in to keep them on board, really, because we needed the control group findings. We also, alongside the quantitative work, the quantitative surveys, we started with actually 25 pairs matching these to look at how the relationships were working. And we interviewed those companies all the way through, and also actually ran some ethnographic work where our researcher went in and worked with a few of the companies to monitor how these relationships were going on, because we wanted to understand, to get greater insight basically into what the surveys were telling us, because surveys tell us fact surveys, and although government likes hard evidence of facts, it's the nuances really that throw such a lot of information onto research. It's those insights, understanding. It's really the more creative part of research, in a sense, that gives you such the depth of understanding. But, you know, we have to, this combination of a kind of economist and a qualitative type of evaluation was fairly unique, because economists are traditionally very anti-qualitative research, because they basically think you just get off the bus and ask somebody a question. So it was quite, we were working together as, Warwick University, Aston University and NESTA, all coming from very different perspectives, a bit like sort of, say, an engineering SME and a creative SME. And so we ourselves were also relationship building, and there's a few tales that went on between the team, but that I won't go into those today. One good thing we're starting, I think, from where, say, qualitative research is perceived as somewhat as a lower status, is that actually people have lower expectations and they're very pleased with what they get. So that was a bonus. Okay, so this is, I've just talked you through a lot of this anyway. Designed as this randomised, controlled methodology. These 3 features. It was a randomised allocation of firms to treatment and control groups. It sounds like a medical study as it was written. Longitudinal data, this collecting over time, these different tranches, to understand how this knowledge was being embedded. How was this creative knowledge being embedded in the organisations? So we looked at this in terms of instead of looking at it in knowledge transfers, we do a lot of work on, we thought about it much more in terms of creative transfer. And this mixed method approach, this combining qualitative with quantitative survey techniques. And so we have, this is just really let's call the theory here. This is basically the project timeline across with these different surveys. We also ran in Manchester some what we call, well, they're not actually focus groups, they're journey-making groups, which are actually very good, because, say, you'd be here today and you'd be throwing all your ideas about what to do, what was required more from us, what different questions they wanted in the survey, and we can put it straight up onto the computers. It will go straight on screen here, which basically you can start analysing it and get your findings back on the same day. That went down very well. And now, when we were evaluating and going back to our respondent groups, they were saying what they actually liked best, really, from us, was the networking. They weren't actually that bothered about the actual policy experiment, but it was the networking they enjoyed. They got most out of networking with each other. And so we ran all these 4 surveys, 2 different tranches. We did 75 in a survey and the next 75 in a survey. So basically we had 8 surveys going out. And at the same time going through the qualitative and doing the interviews. So these 4 main surveys in these different waves over 2 years. Our response rate dropped, particularly on the control group, but it was still enough. We'd got enough for the economists to do their analysis of it, and that was important because we needed to make sure that we'd got hard, rigorous evidence to substantiate our findings. And it's also the way this was designed. This will make sure that we can argue that this study is representative. So you can see here the kind of the sort of the drop off in terms of the control and the treatment group. And I think you'll give these out, won't you? Yeah. So this really is about our response rate. Okay, so in terms of the key results then, when we sent the first survey out, which was sort of 6 months down the line, then everything seemed to be hunky-dory. And actually at that point as well, the discussion and the interviews with to look at the relationships was also, in the main part, it seemed to be working very well. And so they talked about innovating, that they were all, everything was fine. One thing it did, we identified at the first tranche on the first wave, it definitely accelerated the innovation. So companies would say to us, we may have got round to it later on, but we wouldn't have done it now. We couldn't have afforded to do it now. So in a sense, it had brought the innovation forward. So they'd had these ideas. I should say most of our projects as well were actually web-based design. The large majority of people wanted much better web-based design, because they talked about how they needed to have much more confidence in extend their customer base, so that they needed their customers to be more confident in what they were doing. So they needed a good, robust, functional websites that would inspire confidence from their customers. And that was really a lot of it, because so many of our SMEs are exporting, and this was really important for them. So we got comments like this in the qualitative. We couldn't have afforded it. We wouldn't have done it. Some wouldn't have done it at all. It's made a difference to us from that point of view. Allowed us to accelerate things, perhaps made me focus on it rather than putting things off, so it's got things moving quicker than if I'd been left to my own devices. Now, I should also add, obviously the economic climate is also rumbling alongside this, and clearly our SME sector as well as having major successes, we also have major failures within that sector. So in a sense, we've got some difficult things going on as well as this, as much as economists insist that, a random controlled trial experiment cuts out everything out in the context, the historical context. I think it's not actually exactly as it's argued. We've got strong evidence of short-term output additionality. So this has got this strong, to start with, there was evidence to show that sales had gone up, and that was good in the sense that the project itself paid for itself. It was worthwhile doing the project. But there was this widespread evidence of the recession effect. And we also found there was weak learning. In terms of, this short-term additionality was not actually, it did not sustain itself long-term, because what we found by Survey 4, the picture had changed quite significantly. But clearly, within that, our companies, when we were out interviewing them, were saying the banks won't give us loans, we can't innovate. And some as well, what was very clear, some are much higher risk takers than others. So some will take a risk in the recession, others were cutting back. So in a sense, they'd got although they might have had their websites in place, in other ways, they hadn't, the concept of continuing to innovate and to continue to work with the creative was not common to all of them. And this is where we started to get this it was a much more mixed picture than we'd anticipated. Okay, so in terms of the behavioural effects, there was little really evidence of significant behaviour effects. By the end of the 3 years, we found that the control group, who had no input, had no support, were actually as likely to innovate as much as our own respondent group. So what we've realised is that this, for us, this had been much more of a short-termism measure. But also, their confidence had grown in working with creative industries. That was clear, and that came out very much in the qualitative work as well. So they were likely to cooperate. And there was considerable evidence of this all through this gain in confidence, and this was very much us rumbling alongside this, and I'll just go to the quality points in a minute as well, was the quality, were they were saying, well, actually, we have got much greater confidence, because to start with, it was like, well, how do you quantify this work? These were the sort of comments we were getting from the SMEs. How do I know that somebody thinking, how does that allocate the time that they spent on it? Because there seems to be a lack of understanding about the strong advantage to actually using a creative. It isn't like when they seem to be working with their accountants who they see as professionals on the same level and accept their knowledge uncritically. When they're working with the creatives, it's much more about, I don't actually understand these thought worlds, really. I don't understand, you know, because they think differently. We've got quotes saying, you know, they think differently to us. So it was there was very much this feel going on, and it's good. The fact of them working together has actually diminished some of those stereotypes, really. Okay, but, you know, also we have the success stories as well, you know, and, you know, one SME commented, you can see this, you can't just sit back and just do things the same way. We're now thinking about building a French website and a German website. And this particular SME had, through the robustness of the website that he developed and the functionality of it, had actually now, his sales had gone massively, massively higher because he was presenting himself in such a way, and the system to hold that all together was in place, and that was due to the creative. And also some of, you know, we saw who were the risk takers in recession, and those who weren't, you know. So said similarly, if you know, can't actually read that way, if you can't move forward, if you don't take the risk. So some people will take risks. So when we triangulated our results from the qualitative interviews and the ethnographic work, and we triangulated them, and obviously before we knew what the results were from survey 4 on the quantitative, because that is, and we had virtually the same pattern. So out of we started with 25 pairs because we had to have 20. We knew we'd have some dropout. We knew on the qualitative because it's quite intense. And so out of the 20, we'd put in our proposal, we would get 20. We always had to go a bit higher. So we found that where it was actually relationship breakdowns in terms of failures, where it had sort of gone a bit pear-shaped, and 9 of those reported actually that you know, they were failed relationships. 8 of those said they wouldn't work with that particular creative again, but they were okay about working with another creative. And 1, which had got off to a very rocky start, at the end said they might, but to start with it was a very, very rocky start. And this was about poor communication in terms of business procedures. So there'd been sort of promises that they'd be contacted, or personnel had changed and they hadn't been told they'd changed. And so it was sort of mismatching in terms of classic sort of good business practice. And this poor coordination also was part of that same kind of scenario, really, whereby their expectations of what they'd asked for in the first place was not met. Now, this was sometimes because it hadn't been written down. It was sometimes so there'd been a misunderstanding about what they would be given at the end of the project, or actually they'd actually got the wrong person. And the economic climate has rumbled all along, so we couldn't expect a massive, you know, that was one thing that we couldn't control for. But the main criticism of the scheme itself was that the brokerage wasn't robust enough for their selection. And that this is important because, in a sense, this was seen as, to start with, the innovation of the whole scheme was seen this as a very light touch brokerage. But what they said to us in a lot of the interviews was, if we'd have had support from NESTA and yourselves in terms of how we selected our partner, we would have actually had a much better outcome. Because sometimes they hadn't got the right thing, sometimes they'd realised that the creative they'd selected hadn't got the right skills, they hadn't got it written down what they were going to do, and that, as you move forward, you know, please learn by our mistakes. Because this is important. It's so important that you are, you know, that you get the right match, that you work with, whoever you're working with, you can fulfil the need of that client. And I know sort of you'll be working probably with corporates as well. So it's really, really important that you spell it out and you follow those business procedures, etc. Because that's where ours has kind of gone to pot, really. We found that because of this, there was a lack of organisational learning, and that the knowledge that we'd anticipated was not embedded, you know, particularly around these failure areas. But it was really useful because they made good examples of what we could actually do. And you could see from this quote here, you know, they'd have got loads more value from what they were buying because if they'd gone down a completely different route and actually selected somebody, you know, had the kind of guidance to select the company that was best for their innovative problem.